What's up, y'all? Kevin Kuhn here from Athlete Factors. This is the Athlete Factors podcast. My guest today is return guest, Coach Jay. What's up, man? How are you?
Yeah, thanks, mate. I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on again.
For sure. So, the first time we talked was pretty fun. We got to discuss, a little bit of nutrition philosophy and coaching philosophy and all of that. And couple weeks ago, I think it was, you put up a really awesome post, and as soon as I read through it, I was like, we got to do an episode about this. So so before we jump into that, catch us up on how life has been and how things are going and all of that.
Yeah, thanks, mate. I appreciate the positive feedback. So yeah, life hasn't been all too bad, to be honest. Work is keeping me busy, so I'm doing a lot of work with professional football players at the moment, which is kind of new, fun and interesting. It's just a different sporting culture, really. It's been like a bit of a forth and back for me. So I'm living in the UK, but I'm German, so I've still got a few clients in Germany. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that was kind of tricky over the summer with COVID, obviously. So just since travel restrictions have been easing off, been going back to Germany for a few weeks, seeing some family and seeing some clients, doing some seminars and stuff. So it's been a busy but interesting summer, I would say.
That's awesome, man. Yeah, I can't believe that the summer is it's coming to a close. So basically May-ish is when like the high school track season ends, and then as soon as it's over, like we start ramping up for cross country. And like I was busy with coaching the off season and training myself during the off season. We had about 10 or 11 weeks of the off season, and then here we are now. We're basically in our 9th week of our 10-week season. Like we're almost done, and it's starting to feel like fall here. It's not really summer anymore. Although in Texas, it's still like mid-90s today, so it's still hot. But
you shouldn't have mentioned that. I mean, I live in Scotland. Like it's raining like 3/4 of the year, and it already feels like winter. Like it's getting pretty dark.
That's no fun.
It can get like, I don't really mind, to be honest. Like I've not lived like in a really hot country besides 1 year in California as an exchange student. So I'm used to rainy and like mild climate. And it's fine. I don't mind. But still, if I do see photos from like sunny places and you mentioning like what was it, 80 degrees Fahrenheit, or what was it, 75?
Higher than that.
Wow,
sometimes in the 90s.
Man.
Yeah,
that's insane. Like I don't know the current temperature in Fahrenheit here, but just doing like rough estimations, it should be, I don't know, 60 maybe.
Wow. Yeah.
It
might be different. That right when we wake up, like early in the morning before the sun comes out, it can drop into the 60s. But yeah, it's not getting cold yet. But anyway, goodness. Dude, that's so awesome that you're working with some footballers. Here in America, we call them soccer players, but
I know you're not allowed to say that here in the UK though. Like you get some not really strange looks, but people actually do get angry. Like
I bet. Yeah,
it's funny. Like I don't mind. Like I lived in America for a year. I used to say soccer myself, and I pretty quickly realized I better switch to football.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. No, it's one of those things. As a football fan myself, of European football and of American football, like I'm in a weird spot sometimes, because like right now, my Saturday mornings, I wake up, if I'm not going to a cross country meet, then I turn on the TV and I'm watching Arsenal, or I'm watching Man City, I'm watching Premier League, and that's football. And then later in the morning, early afternoon, I'm watching college American football. And
dude, man, I love to watch American college football. So entertaining, so much more fun than NFL.
I agree, man.
And this is something that you would never see nor experience here in Europe is that college sport is just being shown on TV, like, first of all.
Mm-hmm.
And then secondly, that so many people are attending a game. Like, if you go into the stadium, it's packed, man, like 30,000-40,000 people watching a college game. That's, unthinkable here in Europe.
Yeah, it doesn't exist there, right? So
yeah, it's different, not just different countries. I mean, it's just different continents, so it does make sense. But yeah, that was good times watching college football, so I can sort of relate.
That's awesome. Do you have a specific team that you like?
No. No. That's the short answer to that. Not really, no. I was with the NFL. I was like, for a short period of time, I was sympathizing with the San Francisco football team for a while when they, I don't know, must have been 5-6 years back when they made it into the finals. And I think they lost. That was like the final when the lights got switched off completely and was pitch dark for like 90 minutes or something, because I asked my dad to record the game, and he did record the game, but he programmed it, because obviously it was during the night here in Europe, just to be the regular time of I don't know how many minutes or hours, and because it was postponed for quite a few minutes, up to hours, I don't know. I didn't get to see the finish, so that was quite annoying, actually.
Yeah, goodness, that was a game. I remember watching that one. We went over to a friend's house, and one of my friends was a 49ers fan, so they were not thrilled. But
they've done well for a few years, and then I don't know. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the last few years, I'm not even sure if they made it into the playoffs.
I don't really know either.
Yeah, doesn't matter. Like, we're not coaching any American football players, or are you? Just mainly endurance athletes.
Mostly endurance athletes, although here and there I'll get a high school football athlete.
Yeah,
but for the most part, soccer, cross country, track, volleyball, some baseball, tennis.
It's a good mix. It's a good mix of sports. I feel like from a coaching perspective, that keeps the job interesting.
I think so.
Sport has got its own sporting culture, obviously physiological demands and stuff. So yeah, it's I personally feel like it's really rewarding working with different type of athletes coming from different sports, and not just staying within one sport.
I agree. Yeah, I like that I kind of have my background and niche in the endurance world. And most of my adult athletes are endurance athletes, but it's probably about a 50-50 split with my youth athletes that are, some are cross country runners, track athletes, but with the track athletes, it's a lot of sprinters. So completely different types of issues. And then, the rest of the sport. So I like that variety, man. I think it helps keep me sharp. Just because I'm not just looking at the exact same thing over and over and over again and getting in a rut or getting lazy with my programming. I'm just like, oh, okay. All of you distance runners or all of you triathletes or all of you cyclists or swimmers, you're all the same. I'll just train you all this way. Like, I can't really do that. So, yeah. Anyway, so let's discuss this post you put up. So tell us a little bit about kind of just the generals of the post, and then we will we'll move from there.
Sure. Yeah, so I've always wanted to come up with something like an infographic or an illustration that summarizes really what sports nutrition is about, because I feel like whether you call it sports nutrition or performance nutrition, most people, there's still a big misconception about like what it entails and what it actually is. For most people, it is either just supplements. Sometimes it is like building muscles and losing body fat. Like sometimes you hear terms like fueling in the endurance world, more protein, if it's like strength, more hypertrophy focused sports. That's it really. So I've always wanted to, when I'm doing a seminar, when I'm doing working with even athletes, and they don't really understand what sports nutrition is about, not even when I'm talking to coaches. I wanted to create something that summarizes that term correctly and in a way that people can take something away as well. So as I texted you during the last few days, actually I've come up with a different graph or illustration before I created my current sports nutrition pyramid. And that infographic basically was just like throwing all the scientific terms in one picture and trying to kind of summarize it into like 6-7 pillars of, what I think sports nutrition entails, which is for me mainly, obviously, recovery and fueling, then supporting training adaptations, supporting body composition changes. So that can be going either way, supporting muscle growth or supporting body fat loss. And then obviously health, which is a very general and broad term. And then in the first illustration, I've just thrown in, like I said, all the specific terms, like all the supplements, all the different ingredients that have an effect on each of these different aspects or pillars. And it was just very overwhelming. And there wasn't really a takeaway. It was just like, okay, yeah, I knew already that fueling and body composition is part of sports nutrition, but there wasn't really a practical a takeaway, something that can be applied by an athlete or a coach. So I just had that epiphany of, how can I create something or come up with something that creates a hierarchy, or actually taking a step back, I wanted to create something that doesn't look directly at the outcome, let's say body composition, but I was looking at, okay, what is affecting body composition? And obviously the main aspect of that would be energy balance. And then I was like, okay, so doesn't energy balance also affect other aspects of sports nutrition, like health, like training adaptations, like recovery? So that gave me a completely new perspective on how to create something that summarizes sports nutrition. And then I was like, okay, so I was trying to put myself into the perspective of an athlete. Okay, it's like they don't really understand like training adaptations and then specific health terms like leaky gut or whatever. They can't really relate to that. So you need to come up with something that is being understood by every athlete really. And that was another challenge. I wanted it to be applicable for every sport. And of course, like physiological demands are very, very different in different disciplines and sports. Like even within endurance sport, like a middle distance runner has completely different physiological demands than like a marathon runner or even like an ultra marathon runner.
Sure.
So yeah, that's sort of the background story of the thinking that I put into creating my current sports nutrition pyramid. And yeah, I'm actually pretty satisfied with how it turned out.
Yeah, I think it's pretty awesome, which is why I wanted to talk more about it, just because like I relate in that same way, where most of the time I feel that people are only understanding just the surface layer of what sport nutrition is, and you're leaving a whole lot of performance gains and recovery potential, injury reduction on the table if you're just looking at it from this superficial level. So when I first saw it, it reminded me of Eric Helm's muscle and strength pyramid, which involves like energy balance, and I think maybe it was added in later, and I don't know if he added in or other people added in, but like adherence, like that's super important. and then macronutrients, micronutrients, supplements are at the very top, and it was, I think, very useful from the perspective of, let's say you want to increase muscle mass or you want to decrease fat mass. These are your priorities. Follow the pyramid from the bottom up and you'll have a lot of success. And so when I saw your pyramid, I was like, oh, it seems just like that. But then I look a little deeper and I'm like, okay, I don't see fat on here. What's going on with that? So then, I'm reading through your, the text or the description, and I'm like, oh man, there's so much more here than a sports nutrition version of that. So I thought that was really unique. And, this is novel. This is something legitimately different, even though maybe it just at first glance looked like that. I was like, all right, we've got to talk more about this. So let's talk about how it, instead of making it a comparison, from the foundation level of that pyramid up, like, why is it unique? Why is it, how is it practical?
Yeah, very good question. So like I said before, I wanted it to be applicable for all sports. So that was one of the main challenges. So I had to be very aware of terminology and how I wanted to phrase certain things. And I also wanted to mention not the end result, let's say muscle building, or like you mentioned before, adherence, which for me is like the end result. I wanted to take a step back and wanted to mention the aspects that lead to that end result, right? So for me, that was personal preference and the personal lifestyle or needs of a client. With body composition, it was, for example, energy intake rather than just mentioning body composition. Mm-hmm. But yeah, let's start at the beginning. So for me, what was the fundamental aspect of sports nutrition? And for me personally, and you know me, I'm quite into science and reading studies and stuff, but there is no one study, or even if you take multiple studies that give you a clear ranking of different aspects of sports nutrition and in which order to put them. So obviously it's quite a bit of subjective interpretation on my behalf, but I think I've done a pretty fair job. So the fundament for me is being healthy, because if you're not healthy, you can't perform, you can't exercise really. If you're not, and by healthy, I mean, it is kind of taken for granted nowadays, because especially athletes usually do feel well, mm-hmm. but there are definitely a significant amount of athletes that feel, or that go through phases when they just feel down for a few days, or the tank is empty, central nervous system needs a little bit more of recovery. I mean, like serious stuff like hormonal disbalances, like fractures, serious overtraining where they need to take off like a year. Like I've experienced that with females, menstrual health and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So that is the basis. If that's not given, you can't really, you may be able to go for a short run, but you're not able to perform at your maximum level. Mm-hmm. So everything is really affected by your health. But instead of just writing health, which again would be the end result, I've taken the stand of trying to come from what nutritional aspects are resulting in overall health, or having the most pronounced effect on health. Which, I came up with the term healthy and balanced diet. I've also mentioned do no harm, which was more in the sort of description and not in the pyramid itself, which I personally think is very, very important as a coach, mm-hmm. because a lot of coaches just they've heard of a certain nutritional strategy. It doesn't even have to be like a supplement, but like, let's say, going low carb for endurance athletes, and they just read an article, like a blog article or whatever, and they just tell all the athletes like, okay, forget about your carbs, go high fat, low carb. I've read like some pro athlete is very successful with that strategy. And that I'm not just talking about like performance, but health as well. That can have some really, really negative health, general consequences. So yes, that's why I put eating healthy and a balanced diet as number one. And that can be applied to almost any nutritional regimen or diet, if you want to say so. So it doesn't really matter if you are vegetarian, if you're vegan, if you're a meat eater, if you're eating paleo or low carb, you should still meet certain criteria, which is basically eating a lot, sufficient fiber, covering all your micronutrient intakes, eating all your essential fats and stuff like that. So all that falls into healthy and balanced eating, really. So that would be my pick number one.
Perfect. So yeah, I thought it was super important because, like you said, that's often just taken for granted or just assumed, like healthy eating, like that's what dietitians talk about. Sport nutrition, completely different. Like there's a huge overlap here. Everybody needs to ensure that they're like if you don't have your health, it doesn't matter what you're doing to focus on your nutrition or on your diet. Like you have to eat to maintain optimal health first. So I thought that was super important to make that a priority.
It's like you said, it's often taken for granted, and it isn't unless someone is really going through a period where they feel like crap, and then they start to appreciate, okay, this is actually not a given. I need to work for this. I need to it's not just about eating one portion of vegetables a day. You need to adhere to certain nutritional standards over a longer period of time, and if you don't do that, at one point or another, you will definitely, it will backfire, and you will feel, it doesn't have to feel like crap, but you definitely will feel a negative difference,
Yeah. So, one of the other things that I thought about reading that, and this relates a little bit to the next thing, to energy intake, but I think it's important to mention it now, just because you did mention, some of the other things, like in endurance sports, especially 1 or 2 decades ago, the idea was to be as light as possible. And so there were elite level college coaches and high school coaches recommending that their athletes who were running, 50, 60, 70 plus, even 100 plus miles per week, eat no more than 2,000 calories, because you got to be light. You got to be as lean and light as possible. And obviously that led to tons of or immune issues and stress fractures and things like that. And it's like, okay, the whole do no harm thing, that's super important, because you get to a certain point, and maybe this potential performance benefit is actually resulting in a very negative health outcome. And as coaches, it's super important to be aware of that. So,
I couldn't agree more.
So from there, let's kind of segue right into calories and energy balance.
Yeah, I'll try to keep that one short because it's self-explanatory, really. Obviously, energy intake or energy balance is the main factor, if not the factor, driving body composition. But it also, and that you indirectly refer to that with your explanation or your example with the coaches in the 80s and 90s, it can have negative health consequences, and that is being so I was taking that into consideration as well, and that's why I didn't write body composition, but rather energy intake or energy balance. And it's not only health that is being affected by energy balance, it is your recovery and your recovery training adaptations, all these performance related aspects actually as well. If you underfueling chronically, your glycogen stores will be depleted by after a few days or just a week or so. We know that protein synthesis is being activated to a lower degree if you are in a calorie deficit, and it is a significant difference. We're talking about 30% difference. It doesn't really matter. Energy intake really affects a lot of things a lot of things related to sports performance and health in general. So that's why it was my pick number 2.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think like people know, but I think it's so important. Like everybody has this idea, like, okay, how much I eat matters. Like everybody probably knows someone who's had a very, very negative outcome if they try to exercise or train intensely and they haven't eaten anything that day. Like we're not talking about fasted cardio. We're talking about intense training off of no food that day or off of some junk food that day. Like you can have, I won't name any names, but there was an athlete on our team who didn't eat well and took a spill, let's say, went down for the count, and things were not good. And that was very scary. So like energy intake, it always comes back to everything has a cost. When it comes to the human body, everything has a caloric cost. You have to pay for whatever you're doing. You've got to pay for the training. There's a cost to that. You have to pay for the recovery. There's a cost to that. There's a cost to maintaining your immune function. There's a cost to maintaining, everything. Everything has a cost. There's no such thing as a free lunch, especially when it comes to movement, training, adaptations, recovery, all of that. And it doesn't matter if you are following a nutrient timing strategy that allows you to replenish your glycogen stores immediately after training. That doesn't matter if you're in such a calorie deficit because you have no idea how many calories you need to ingest and how many calories you're expending. That has to be a priority.
Absolutely. And just picking up on that example that you mentioned, that is actually a really good example for showing or discussing why energy intake is so important. Because even if you're taking in a lot of carbs right after training, but you are being in an overall energy deficit, you are not replenishing your glycogen stores as efficiently as you would be if you be in a eucaloric diet or even if in a caloric surplus. So that's why energy intake is so important. Like you said, it has an effect on everything really. Recovery, immune system, health, body composition, and most people think it's just fat mass and that's it, but it's so much more to it.
Sure. Yeah, I'm doing a little bit of a series on my podcast where I'm reading chapters from the first book I wrote, which is all about hormones. And so many of these hormones, leptin, ghrelin, insulin, CCK, PYY, GLP-1, all these hormones have a different effect if you're in calorie maintenance versus calorie surplus versus calorie deficit. And so you have to know that. It's important to know that. It's not just all those things. Even your hormonal function, it's different if you're not aware of your energy balance, energy intake, things like that. So
yeah.
So what's next in this?
Yeah. So what's
hierarchy?
next? And I think this is one of the biggest differences between my pyramid and the Eric Harm's pyramid. And instead of just saying macronutrients, I specifically decided to write down carbohydrates, protein, and overall fluid intake. And so I exchanged dietary fats with fluids. And the reason behind this is that if you look at the literature, scientific literature, there's no real mechanism nor any overall evidence that's pointing out that dietary fat has a direct impact on sports performance. With the maybe only exception of MCT oils when you're on a low carbohydrate diet. That's like the only scenario that I can think of, but that's really it. Obviously, carbs are important for every sport, really more important for sport with high intensity, longer duration, protein more important with like shorter duration, high intensity, like hypertrophy, sort of anaerobic demands. But dietary fat there's no direct link between fat and performance. And the reason behind this is that we've got plenty of dietary fatty acids stored as body fat. So yes, we're using within any sport really, but mainly within endurance sport, we're using a lot of fatty acids as for production of ATP for energy. But if you're not eating that many dietary fats, the body's just simply breaking down body fat into triglycerides, 3 fatty acids, and a glycerol, and then it's being oxidized. And so we get so many, so much energy being stored as dietary fat that it doesn't really matter once you've reach a certain minimal intake that is required. And I think that's important to mention. But that minimal intake is only, or is mainly important for your health. For you need dietary fats for the absorption of certain vitamins, for the production of hormones, for the production of digestive juices, for example. So there are important properties to dietary fats, or aspects that we do need dietary fats for. But I place that into the first pillar of my pyramid, which is health and not performance. And that's why I didn't mention dietary fats separately. And I skipped that one and decided to, I wanted to focus more on the performance aspect. And I felt the fluid is definitely worth a mention here, which wasn't, if I remember correctly, wasn't mentioned in the Eric Helms version of the pyramid.
Correct. Yeah. No, I think.
And then,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So I think just one or two quick sentences to add on to that. Obviously, the emphasis between carbs and protein and fluid, they vary a little bit between sports, like no doubt. Obviously, if you're just doing like you're hitting the gym, weights for, you want to look like, I don't know, some shredded guy for the beach. Protein is probably most important. Fluid intake can probably be neglected. And yeah, carb intake is like sort of in the middle. With the endurance sports, carbs are more important, protein less important, mainly because you're eating so many calories anyways that it's very easy to reach your required amounts of protein. So yeah, these are just two examples of how the importance of each of the aspects within that one pillar, meaning carb, protein, and fluid, can vary slightly between different sports. So I think that's important to mention. But overall, this was the 3 aspects I placed in sort of the third pillar of my sports nutrition. And I didn't just want to write down like macronutrients because I thought that wouldn't give sports nutrition justice.
Yeah, like you said, with the exception of like medium chain triglycerides or maybe ketones, you could classify as a potential quote unquote fat supplement, but even ketones it's not fat, right? So it's something different. It's something made from the metabolic processes around fat metabolism. So yeah, with those exceptions, like there's very few people, because I can't say there's no one, but there are very few people who are ingesting fat during any activity and seeing a performance benefit from it. Like even if you're like zero carb or such a low carbohydrate diet, like you've quote unquote fat adapted your body and metabolism to run efficiently on that. But if you added in some carbohydrate, I'm sure your performance would improve. So,
I mean, we'll come to that later. I mean, the sort of train low, compete high regimen. I mean, there's definitely evidence behind it, and I'm not saying it doesn't work. But even if you look at the pro level of triathlon and long endurance sports in generally, it is only making up a very small margin of the overall training volume. Mm-hmm. So that's why I think it is still okay not to mention dietary fats by themselves. And I place sort of these strategies in like specific sport-specific challenges. Mm-hmm. Right? That's the sort of the terminology that I came up with. But yeah, we'll dive into that later.
Yeah, no, I like that. So, so progressing from that, what's the next priority, or what's the next layer?
So yeah, next is really keeping simple and straightforward is nutritional strategies around training. So pre-workout, intra-workout, and post-workout for fueling and recovery, really. And it doesn't really matter which sport you do, if it's a team sport like football or soccer, if it's endurance sports or even strength sports. Yes, the emphasis of each of the three different aspects I mentioned might be different. For example, like for an endurance athlete, it might be more important to fuel during a workout, mm-hmm. whereas for a strength athlete, the recovery aspect and protein intake after training is more important. Mm-hmm. But that's why I phrase it peri-workout nutrition, which is basically a summary term for nutritional strategies around training. So pre, intra, and post-workout nutrition. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, I mean, and that it kind of makes sense. This is where the body is primed to absorb nutrients and to support training adaptations on a cellular level, right? This is where we need to fuel the body, replenish energy stores, glycogen stores. We need to provide amino acids for muscle protein synthesis, et cetera, et cetera. We need the carbs and certain micronutrients to support the immune system, mm-hmm. And so forth.
Yeah, I think this is often considered the nutrient timing. It's quite trendy, and it often, unfortunately, takes a lot of the emphasis, or people spend more time, and we kind of talked about this earlier, but focusing on like, okay, I've got to get X amount of protein and X amount of carbs now because I just finished training. And they do that, and they're still in a calorie deficit by 500 calories for the day, or 1,000 calories for the day, or whatever the case may be. And like, it is important, but as you've set it up, like, it's still not as important as health. It's still not as important as energy intake. It's not as important as your total carb intake and your total protein and maintaining your hydration status. Like, there's a whole lot of other stuff involved there. So I think it is important, but it is not the most important. And I like the way that you've structured it that way and explained it that way, because it can have significant effects.
Oh, absolutely, no doubt. It's definitely important. It shouldn't be neglected, but mm-hmm. I think it's like you said, this is what people, or by people I mean athletes, really, this is what they focus on, and not just focus on, but this is the only focus oftentimes. Like, yeah. Okay, it only matters what I eat after training. Mm-hmm. And then they go back on their crappy diet or not eating or whatever.
Yeah, I think a lot of that, unfortunately, was from like, so when I got to grad school, like, our nutrition classes were like, everything is nutrient timing, and everything is this post-exercise anabolic window, and that was the focus. And like, everybody thought like, okay, this is it, this is the thing. And that was unfortunately detrimental, because it kind of threw under the bus all of those other layers of the pyramid that are foundational to that portion of the pyramid actually providing benefits. So yeah, I think luckily, I think people are starting to understand that, and hopefully getting this message out will, provide some education, and this is practical, y'all. Like, this is super helpful. If you're focusing just on your your pre-workout and taking a pre-workout with a ton of stimulants and caffeine, and then getting your protein shake on the back end, like that's really not doing yourself the most good. Like there's things you should be prioritizing.
And I think the main reason behind that is because, I mean, it kind of makes sense because, eating matters when or right after you've worked out. But B, I think it's mainly because people are lazy. And it gives them an excuse to just focus on one meal rather than, implementing a dietary strategy for an entire week, for different training demands, for an off day, for an intense day, for competition, for traveling. That's work, man. And that's why you need, not everyone, but some athletes do need a nutritionist, because it is not, like you said, just about the post or pre-workout meal. There's so much more to it. And if you look at the pyramid, it's right in the middle. So yes, it is important, but other aspects are definitely more important. And I think you've done a very good job of explaining and mentioning why in the grand scheme of things, energy intake and eating healthy, and especially carbs and protein over the day, the total amount, are a lot more important than just what you eat right after training or before.
Yeah. So I think this just kind of made me, think of this, like when I'm explaining these concepts, especially to a younger athlete, sometimes it's like, all right, it's going to be way too much to try to get them to understand their total, like what is healthy. Like, yeah, they have an idea. So like explain to them like, okay, you need to make sure that you're eating healthy food and you're maintaining your health, and what does all that mean? And then from there, like trying to get a middle school athlete or even a high school athlete to understand energy intake is sometimes like a bridge too far. It's maybe not age appropriate, maybe that's too much to focus on. So sometimes I'll start with peri-nutrition for an athlete who's younger, just because like, hey, you can be responsible for this. And we start here and we'll cover more concepts and more priorities as we go forward. But let's start here and then let's build out from there. And I think, like I said, especially for younger athletes or for someone who's never really spent any time prioritizing health and nutrition at all in general, like starting with like, what are some steps that you can control right now and that you can ensure that we're making progress, and then kind of building out from there. I don't know if you found that to be helpful as well, but.
No, absolutely. I've recently been working with some youth footballers as well, and communication and wording is everything. And I mean, depending on the age, but most of them are still eating at home, right? So they can't really influence what's being put on their plate for dinner. And to change that, you would have to talk to the parents directly, but not only that, but convince them to change probably their own diet and cooking in order to, have a sustainable effect on the health and the performance of their children. So that's, I agree. You have to differentiate between the theoretical difference it makes and what is realistic in real world, right? So you should just work with what you have, both as a coach as an athlete. In an ideal world, yes, the carbs would be, the proportion of carbs and the portion sizes would be bigger on a high intensity day after training. But to implement that with all the parents of an entire team is close to impossible.
Yeah.
You can run a seminar and educate the parents, but like how many are going to change and implement what you've taught them? It's not that many. So yeah.
Alrighty. So what's next?
Yeah, the next one is an interesting one. I've came up with the term sport specific challenges, and it really took me a while to find a good wording for that one, because I'll just throw a few terms out there. Like every sport has got its own culture, really. And with that, I mean, it's probably easiest to explain with an example. For example, when I was in the States, I was 17 years old and I did wrestling in high school. And I've never done any combat sports before. So obviously the weight cut was completely new for me, and that is very sport specific. So that's combat sports or weight category sport specific. With other sports, it's travel, depending on, especially in the States, actually, distances are just so much longer than here in Europe. Like even youth teams, they travel hours, many, many hours on a bus. That's not a thing here, This is very sport specific. So that doesn't really apply to, or that issue or challenge only applies to certain sports. Other things would be, or other examples would be for endurance sports would be exposure to heat, right? So running in the heat for many, many hours in Texas where it's hot, right? Or for example, in other sports, it may be rules. That's an interesting one as well, because you can plan as much as you want. If there's no access for the athlete to fuel or rehydrate during a competition, there's nothing you can do really. So rules do matter as well. So these are all sport-specific challenges that can differ between sports, and that's why I chose a very generic term.
Yeah, in high school cross country and track, there is no intra workout nutrition. That's not a thing that exists. And because of that, and this is extremely unique, the emphasis on doing some workouts either fasted or before you've had carbohydrates for the day can be a potential signal for your body to either become more reliant on body fat as a source of fuel, or a stimulus to, as you go into your post-workout nutrition, increase glycogen stores. So like the sport-specific challenges are definitely huge. Like, and if you're not aware of that and you're just following a generic, meal plan or nutrition strategy for, basketball, where they have multiple timeouts, like college basketball, even college basketball, media timeouts, where you've got, they've got to run 2 to 3 minutes of commercials. So that's how long your timeout is. Like there's a long time for you to refuel and rehydrate and recover, versus a collegiate 10K where you've got 6.2 miles of continuous effort and there's nothing you can do to pause or take a break, or there's no timeouts. So understanding those differences, I think, is really important.
And I think it's important to mention that obviously as an athlete and as a coach as well, you only need to be aware of the challenges within your one sport, right? So you don't have to read up on weight cut if you're an endurance athlete. I mean, that's self-explanatory. But just be aware of what the challenges are for you and your sport, and then discuss with your coach or nutritionist, come up with a strategy that works for you. So that's where the individualization and try to customize everything individually to your personal needs also comes into play.
Awesome. Yeah. So from there, what's next?
Yeah. So next is, you could say, quality of macronutrients. I've decided to ditch the fats again. So it's just quality or type of protein and carbohydrates. Both are known to have effects with proteins on muscle protein synthesis. With carbohydrates is both the type of carbohydrates, meaning if it's a simple sugar or a longer sugar chain making a polysaccharide, it does have an effect on glycogen replenishment, but the overall difference between, let's stick to the carbohydrate example. If you're eating 400 grams of carbohydrates, most of it is long-chained carbohydrates, then the difference will be very small to a diet where it's 400 grams with mainly sugars, which are being absorbed quicker. But the overall difference can be neglected, really. And it's very similar with protein as well. Yes, if you're comparing 20 grams or 25 grams of animal protein to a single source of vegan protein, let's say wheat protein, yes, there is a difference in muscle protein synthesis. But then again, you have to remind yourself, this is only a cellular signal. If you look at studies that compare the outcome, which is muscle growth and or performance, I mean, the difference are minute, if not even existing, if overall protein intake and carbohydrate intake are being met, right? So this is why this is placed in the further towards the bottom in the pyramid, and the type or the quality of protein and carbohydrate are less important.
Yeah, that's a hard pill for some people to swallow, man. Like,
yeah, sorry to disappoint you guys.
Yeah, people get so dogmatic about the quality of what they eat, which a lot of that stems from the the clean eating kind of side of maybe sports nutrition, where it's like I don't have to worry about how much I'm eating because I'm eating all these high quality foods. Well, that's great, it's important, but at the end of the day, quantity tops quality. Like I agree 100% with you on this. Like it's important. And that's the thing. People are like, oh, you don't think the quality of my protein and my carbs are important? No. Yeah, it's very important, but it's not as important as hitting your protein need for the day and hitting your total carbs for the day. Like,
there's also to add something to that, I think, to avoid misconception of what I meant with the terming or the terminology here. Protein quality mainly refers to the amino acid profile, right? It doesn't mean whether it's an organic chicken that has been raised in a farm and seen sunshine for a year or two versus like a chicken that's never been outside and only lived three months and has been fed like antibiotic food or whatever, right? That's not what I mean with quality here. So with protein, I'm referring to the amino acid profile, and with the type of carbs, and that's why I don't specifically say quality with the carbohydrates. Type of carbohydrates is simple sugars with this, help me out here with the word, what's another word for complex carbohydrates I'm looking for here? It's getting late.
I don't know. We've got monosaccharides, polysaccharides. We've got
polysaccharides is more the scientific term. Anyways, starch, starchy carbohydrates. So yes, that's very important for overall health to eat starchy carbohydrates, but that falls into the category of healthy eating and doesn't really have an effect on performance. So yeah, I just wanted to throw that out and mention it because I think it's important to take that into consideration. And then also, what's really funny sometimes, I don't know how familiar you are with or you're following the bodybuilding community, but you always hear like even like Mr. Olympia, winners, it's important to mix up your protein sources like tuna and then chicken and then beef, all the different amino acids. Like, no. Like it's just a simple no. Like unless you're a vegan, if you look at the amino acid profiles, they're so similar. It's so similar. Like there's almost no difference between beef and chicken. And if you're a vegan, yes, it's important to eat multiple sources of plant-based proteins, but that's the exception. And other than that, it doesn't really matter to mix up different protein sources. It's probably important for other health reasons to get different, micronutrients, some has more zinc. The other food is more copper, vitamin B12, whatever. So yeah, there are other reasons, but with regards to muscle building, it's, you know, it can be completely neglected.
Sure. Yeah. If all you're eating is, let's say tuna or sardines, or if you're only eating certain types of fish, maybe you might have an issue with mercury, and that would be a problem. But
yeah, that's a good one. Yeah.
Yeah, but I agree with you that that falls under health. Like that's
exactly
priority number one. So from there, we're almost to the tip of the pyramid. But what's number 7, or what's the next step?
Yeah, so that probably requires some further explanation. It's not self-explanatory. So I named it Strategies for Extreme Physical Demands. And you can basically think of that for, it's a description of an overreaching phase in training. So basically, if you have a training block and you've come off a taper, you start off easy, and you're starting a few weeks with medium intensity, then you're going high intensity, and towards the end, you're going all out. You feel like you can't walk after training. You feel like shit for multiple hours. Within elite sports, it might be certain training camps that prepare you for major competitions. It can be high altitude training for endurance athletes. It can be training camps for combat sport athletes. It can be off season for American football and European football, where they, really trying to build up their aerobic and anaerobic training system. So this is what I'm meaning by extreme physical demands. And depending on the sport, it requires different nutritional strategies to, I don't want to say counter, but because the physiological stress is so high, there's a need for additional nutrients, additional calories, additional fluid. And it might actually be a time to take a multivitamin or an antioxidant, when I would never recommend to do that on a daily basis for anyone, really, if you're eating healthy. And there are actually studies showing that it might counteract training adaptations to take vitamin C or vitamin E on a higher dosage. But if the stressor is so high, you need more antioxidants as well. And oftentimes what I experience as a coach is, unfortunately, the higher the training intensity and the higher the training volume, that does affect and the hunger sensation as well. So athletes just don't want to eat. They feel hungry the day after, maybe, but not the 10 or 8 hours after training, when they're training in the morning. Right. They just feel so racked, they want to sleep, and they completely forget to train. And that's like to eat, excuse me. And that's like the worst thing you can do. So there are definitely things to consider during training blocks when you're going all out from multiple angles. That's basically the thinking behind that. Obviously, depending on the level you're competing at, you might actually never do like an overreaching phase. Like, people have no idea how hard that can be at an elite level. We're talking like extreme physical exhaustion here. So it's not like a triple training, like, I feel sore after training for a day. Like we're talking, you don't want to move for 3 days, but you have to go and do it again the next day.
Yep.
And so there are multiple things to consider depending on the sport you're doing. And like altitude training is a good example for, obviously, the change of geological location as well. So that's the thinking behind the second to last pillar, which I call strategies for extreme physical demands.
Yeah, I think that's another important one to include, just because there are, depending on your sport, there are phases, or there are times where you can't just, like, the status quo isn't going to cut it. Like, you're doing things that do require you to add things in or to change things in order for you to be able to see it through to the end. Like, overreaching can be extremely effective, but only if you are like you can't be in an overreaching phase forever. Like that's not a long-term successful strategy. So the you know the punishment has to fit the crime, right? Like the strategies that you employ have to meet the demands that you're imposing. So I think that's
absolutely. And I think it's not just from a nutritional standpoint, like a lot of recovery strategies need to be adapted and potentially changed. For example, we know that doing like being exposed to cold water or doing like an ice bath, that can have a positive effect on short-term recovery, but it might blunt long-term training adaptations on a cellular level. So you don't want to do that on a daily basis, which is like a mistake many pro athletes actually do. They have like their own little ice bath in the backyard. They're doing it after every training session. It's not something you want to do. Same with like taking a sauna, similar, just different temperature, but kind of like does have similar effects. But there is a place for these strategies, and I would say it is doing these very high demands during a certain training cycle. And it does apply to nutrition as well. Like one strategy that I specifically, like I work with a lot of CrossFit athletes, for example. And when they have or go through an overreaching phase or a competition, I make sure they're taking high antioxidants to reduce muscle damage. I make sure they take tart cherry juice, so concentrated cherry, to again reduce delayed muscular soreness. But never recommend any athlete to do that on a daily basis, because again, it's kind of like taking away the need for the body to adapt to the stress, right? Because you're how am I phrasing this best? You're giving the body extra tools for a quick fix, but that's robbing you from the opportunity to adapt to the stressor in the long term yourself.
Right. Yeah,
that makes sense.
The training is to send a signal. And then if you employ these high dose antioxidants, well, now you're blunting that signal. So your adaptation, like you just did all that training and now you won't maximize the benefit from it.
Exactly. You're taking something that's doing the job for you, whereas you want your body, your natural physiology to adapt to that stressor to training.
Last but not least, unfortunately, this tends to be most people's initial idea when it comes to sport nutrition. So what can you tell us about supplements?
Supplements, yeah. I do recommend supplements, actually. It's not that I hate them, but there's a small list that has a good evidence behind them. It has to be sport specific, so not every supplement works for every sport. It should be matched with the training cycle. So even within the sport, you're going through different demands and training different training systems. So that needs to be taken into consideration. And then if you look at the overall effect that supplements have on performance, it's really small. It really is small. And especially, I think we've chatted about this briefly right after our first chat. And that is the fact that supplements, it pretty much doesn't matter which one, they have a smaller effect in trained athletes than in beginners. And the difference between training levels between a novice athlete and a serious competitive athlete is quite big. And I would argue with a competitive athlete that has 5 to 10 years of training under the belt, you won't see more than 1% difference with regards to performance. And with that, I mean just one certain type of training. So obviously, when you take creatine, for example, it is mainly strength and potentially hypertrophy. You're not going to run faster because of hypertrophy of creatine. Whereas with the beginner, we see massive increases in muscle mass and strength performance, all the way up to 5%, if not even more. And that may not sound that much, not 0.5 to 1% versus 5%. But if you like do the math and compared with the numbers, it's a massive difference. It really is. And another good one is nitrate, or what is more popular among athletes is the beetroot concentrate.
Yep.
I can't remember the author, but I can send it over to you if you're interested. They did a really interesting study where they had 3 different groups in which they allocated the participant based on their VO2 max. Right, I think it was might have been under 45, between 45 and 60, and then over 60 or over 65, something like that. To distinguish between like a beginner, a trained athlete, and then a well-trained athlete. And they actually saw this very strong correlation between the higher the level of fitness, the lower the effect of the supplement. And actually within the elite ranks, and I might have to correct myself, I think it was higher than 60 or 65 VO2 max. I think it was more 70, but I can look it up. There was actually 0% difference in performance. Whereas with beginners, I think it was 4 point something.
Wow.
And so it's massive. And I think it's an aspect that's completely overlooked. Again, I do recommend and use supplements with my athletes, but there are so many other aspects that should be taken into consideration and worked on before you extend your supplement list.
Sure. No, I totally agree with that. Like at the end of the day, it's to fill in a gap. And if there's a gap, why not address that because if there is a gap, then it's probably having an effect on your health. And it's probably
absolutely. Like good example, I was just finished working with a youth football player, and no matter what, like he only liked 2 vegetables. It's pepper and cucumbers. That's all he ate. And well, like cucumber, you can't really put in any hot dishes. It's like you don't want to put cucumber in a curry or on a pizza. It's not working that well.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I was running a few analyses, and I knew he was, it was very likely that he was deficient in a few micronutrients. So, of course, I recommended a multivitamin, including some minerals from a reputable source, which was checked from a third party. So, he wouldn't pop up for doing anti or doping tests with like contaminated substances. So that's something to consider as well. But yes, this is one of the exceptions, where one of these supplements do make sense and they will have a direct effect both on health and probably performance. And there are a few others only affect performance: caffeine, creatine, sodium bicarbonate, and whatnot, like 2 or 3 more. But that's it really. Like as endurance athlete, yes, sport drinks, electrolytes, and carbohydrates. But that's it really. Anything else falls into the category of like, okay, nice to have, or even might do harm. Coming back to the first pillar of the pyramid, there are actually studies showing that taking my brain's just stopping to work here. It's getting late here. We're talking about with the fatty acids and the fat metabolism, the substance that you take to support fatty acid metabolism and potentially improve performance. Does that ring a bell?
MCT,
yeah, MCT, ketones. Ketones is the word I was looking for.
Yeah.
So there are obviously different types of ketones, but there are a few studies actually showing that, okay, it's not only not improving performance, but it might be detrimental to performance.
Wow.
And might make you run slower. So that's, or for example, with sodium bicarbonate, it has a hell of evidence showing that it's actually really effective improving performance. But at what cost? Like
you might poop your pants.
50 to 60% of the people ending up in the bathroom and not coming out again.
Sure. Yeah.
Right? So a lot of digestive issues. So a lot of things to take into consideration when you are recommending or not recommending a certain supplement.
Mm-hmm. No, I think you're totally right. Another thing about ketones is the type, like you said, like if it's
Absolutely.
bound to salt versus like bound to like the liquid ketone versus the powdered ketones. Like if you go a little too heavy with those ketones, you might be ingesting a huge bolus of electrolytes, of calcium or magnesium or whatever the case may be, and that can have some seriously negative effects too if you're mega dosing perhaps with some of those electrolytes that can mess up your hydration status pretty quick. So
I mean the ketone esters versus the ketone salts. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Massive difference.
For sure.
I mean, we do need more research, and as always, context matters. With this one, for example, your budget is so expensive. Like, even if it does improve your performance by, I don't know, a tiny bit, like, unless you're a professional athlete and are being sponsored, it's very unlikely that you can afford taking that supplement on a daily basis for a prolonged time.
Yeah, those ketone esters are not cheap. That's for sure.
So that's really my pyramid, with the addition of, in the Eric Helms pyramid, it was adherence. And as I described earlier, I was trying to describe it more from a practical perspective of what do you have to do to increase adherence. And for me, that's adapting and customizing recommendations based on the personal needs and preferences of a client. If that's being met, then the likelihood that the adherence of anyone is high is not too bad.
Mm-hmm. For sure. So that's pretty concise, man, to explain all that. Like, yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot if you dig deep, but from like just looking at it, like it's not so over the top or complex that like everyone can, can pull something extremely practical and useful from this. So, what do you think is the most important takeaway from this, like for athletes when they look at your sport nutrition pyramid?
I think you've actually done a fairly good job of summarizing what my takeaway would be, and that is, making sure to tick the basics, check them off as often as possible. And that means eating healthy, meeting your energy requirements. And as an athlete, that sort of can be checked by, if you're a youth athlete, yes, your body weight might not just be affected by body fat and muscle mass, just simply because you're maturing, you're growing. But then again, you can measure your waist circumference as a plus. If that's not going up, but the total weight is going up, you basically know that you're not gaining fat mass, and all the weight that you're gaining is either bone, water, or muscle mass. So that's a simple way to do it, and I think is more applicable than using any scientific equations to calculate your personal calorie requirements and then tracking your calorie intake for multiple days and doing adjustments. It's all very fancy stuff, but just checking your weight on the scale and potentially measuring your circumference of your waist is completely sufficient in my opinion. So those two aspects are very important. And then next would be, okay, total carb and protein intake with adjustments or with considerations to your specific sport, obviously. So if it's a strength sport, higher protein, or lower to medium carb intake, and if it's endurance sports or team sport, it's rather the high end of carb intake and medium intake of protein. If you check off these boxes, you're doing a lot of things right already, right? And then the recovery nutrition and the nutritional strategies right before you work out or match day, probably next important. And I think with that, I want to add, it's very important that you test things in training before you apply anything for a match or competition. And anything else that we've discussed is like the cherry on the top. Right? So it's eating healthy, making sure you're not overeating or undereating, making sure you're meeting your carb and your protein intake. Have a good idea of how much fluid you're losing, how much, your sweat rate, and then have a go at your recovery and pre-workout nutrition, and that's it really. Like work your way up. Usually you can check off a few of these boxes already, so you won't have to focus on all 4 of the things that I've mentioned. Maybe it's just 1 or 2. And if it's all 4 things that you've been doing great already, then great. I mean, then that's like the reward. Then you can get to work on the specifics, on the details, and it's a lot more fun. I get that, but make sure to tick off the basics first.
I can't say any of that any better than that. That's perfect. It's a good way to round it out.
Thank you.
So, so how can people follow you? How can they reach out to you? How can they make that happen?
So yes, I'm being found by the company's name is Athlete Coach, and athlete is written L-E-A-T. So like we would eat, eating food. You'll find me on Instagram, on my website. The website is athletecoach.com. Handle on Instagram is just athlete coach. And I'm posting regularly. I'm trying to interact with all my followers. I'm coaching clients with all different types of sporting backgrounds. So I'm not just posting about strength sport or one other sport. I'm trying to mix it up and keep it interesting for my audience.
Love it, man. Well, I love your posts. I think they're extremely educational, and every once in a while I'll like compare the English to like the German, and I'm like, okay, never mind. I'll just scroll back to the English. But I think it's always fun to look at that, because it's just.
I've just decided to create a second Instagram channel, and the main one the one I'm running at the moment is going to be solely in English, and then the new one is going to be just in German. So that was kind of a challenge for me and my followers to kind of like mix the 2 languages. I was doing my very best, but I completely understand it was kind of like hard to follow at sometimes.
Yeah, I thought it was cool. I mean, I only know 1 language, man. So yeah, it's always good to I think be exposed to things outside of just what you know. So dude, it's always good to talk with you. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time, and I can't wait till we get you on again. I know you're gonna post something awesome in the future, and I'll be like, hey, let's talk about it. So
yeah, I hope so. Once in a while, I come up with something great, and then for the remaining 11 months of the year, I feel like I'm doing mediocre stuff, but I guess that's still better than what most people come up with. So,
well, that's true. I think all your stuff's pretty good. I think it's obvious that you're putting some time and effort into it, and I can tell. So I appreciate it.
Yes, mate. Appreciate it.
For sure.
Well, all right. It's been fun to be on back again. Always good to catch up and talk some nutrition, and hope a few athletes have taken a few things away. That's the main point why I'm doing this is to help athletes. If it's just 1 or 2 that have taken a few practical things away and what to focus on and why, then goal accomplished, man.
I agree. Awesome. Alrighty, y'all. Well, thanks for watching and listening. Stay tuned for next week's episode. Adios.